Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Palestine, a Socialist Introduction. Edited by Sumaya Awad and Brian Bean. Narrated by Jeed Saddy. Introduction. About this book. Sumaya Awad and Brian Bean. The Palestinian cause is not a cause for Palestinians only, but a cause for every revolutionary, wherever he is, as a cause of the exploited and oppressed masses in our era. Ghassan Kanafani. This book is born in the midst of a highly polarized political movement in the long historical struggle for the liberation of Palestine. The winds of sympathy for the Palestinian people blow among the peoples of the world, and a solidarity movement, with boycott, divestment, and sanctions as the key components, blossoms. At the same time, repression carried out by states and governments against Palestine activism has been fierce. In Palestine, the situation is dire, with the expansion of settlements, possible annexation in the West Bank, and the unlivable conditions of the open-air prison of Gaza. The political movement is trapped at an impasse of never-ending peace talks over the terms of oppression and occupation that has been the status quo since the 1993 Oslo Accords. Donald Trump's so-called deal of the century, which amounts to official adoption of apartheid, is the grim culmination of this process. At the same time, there is new hope in the waves of mobilizations like the Great March of Return in Gaza, but also beyond Palestine, across the Arab world, from Iraq to Lebanon to Iran. All of this is situated in a Middle East and North Africa region that continues to erupt in revolts and uprisings against unjust economic conditions and undemocratic governments. These are local and regional expressions of a global economic and climate crisis that has produced a worldwide refugee crisis of staggering proportions, a rise internationally of far-right forces and governments, and looming military tension between the major world powers. The future of Palestine is woven into this fabric of despair and resistance. The liberation of Palestine is bound to the struggle against the global capitalist system, its local governments, states, and imperialist forces. The growth of the current movement must be seen as part of the broader radicalization against systems of oppression, inequality, and racism, and for refugee rights. This process can in some ways be traced to 2008, when a deep crisis gripped the global capitalist system. The shock of the first major global economic crisis of the neoliberal period tore down the curtain of illusory progress to reveal how far-reaching and ugly are the structures of global capitalism. This epochal change occurred alongside the futile perpetuation of U.S. wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and in the same year as decimation was unleashed on Gaza by Israel in the first of its 3 deadly wars over a 6-year period on the besieged area. The brutality of Operation Cast Lead, as Israel called it, was displayed around the world via social media, inspiring outrage and street demonstrations. This confluence of factors created space for a resurgence of activism around Palestine, first with campus activism, and a broader solidarity movement reflected in the call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, BDS, against Israel. From 2011 to our current moment, the movement has expanded and reformed organically to fit the social and political tides of struggle. This unfurling can be understood in the context of mass struggles against austerity and racism. The Occupy movement, Black Lives Matter, the teachers' strike wave, the wildcat strikes of essential workers during COVID-19, and the rebellion against anti-Black racism and police terror. Together, these struggles have played a critical role in buoying mass sympathy with Palestine and creating the sea change we find ourselves in today. A new political vision and path forward are being formulated amid a polarized situation of both great gains and fierce reaction. What to do? We hope this book is a contribution to the flowering sentiment of justice for Palestine that is blooming amid a political moment presenting massive challenges. A combination of the crisis of the world capitalist system, austerity measures, and the intensification of attacks on oppressed groups, including Palestinians, is producing this radicalization, more developed in some places than in others, and unevenly in all cases, in which we find ourselves. More than ever, these new activists see the wrongs they oppose as a common manifestation of a systemic problem: capitalism. The solution to this vampiric system is seen increasingly to be socialism. In the last 3 years, we've watched the idea of socialism go from being taboo to a recurring term debated in the mainstream news, in angry right-wing tirades, and in popular magazines like Teen Vogue. Numerous opinion polls reflect that, especially among people under 35, socialism is as popular as capitalism, an astounding development in a country that is the capital of capitalism. This red flowering has progressed along a post-2008 timeline similar to the arc of the sentiment around Palestine. It is this connection between the cause of Palestine and the struggle for socialism that we argue is necessary. The recurring themes and concepts rooted in the foundation of this book are socialism and imperialism. As buzzwords can often be the bane of leftist political movements, we want to briefly clarify what we mean and what we don't mean by the terms that we use. Socialism. What we mean when we say socialism is, simply put, a society where workers collectively own and democratically control their labor and the value they produce. In other words, a classless society, free of exploitation and oppression. Its essence is evoked in two common phrases of Marx, who described socialism as a world from each according to their ability and to each according to their need, which comes into realization through the self-emancipation of the working class. This is different from conceptions of socialism like the social democracy of the Scandinavian mixed economies, and different from the former USSR and North Korea, often referred to as Stalinist countries, or the current Chinese state, which can be generally described as a capitalist dictatorship with certain sectors of the economy owned by the state, whose role is to integrate the private sector into the world economy. All of these forms can be described as socialism from above, state control of some part of industry through a top-down, bureaucratic, and more often than not, authoritarian stratum of society. Even though the USSR is now a thing of the past, the political tendency of Stalinism still exists and is referred to in chapters of this book. Although definitions vary, we will briefly describe it as a political tendency based on the false notion that socialism can be established in a single country rather than through the international rejection of capitalism. Stalinism often takes a rigid approach to socialist revolution, regarding it as marked by distinct stages. First, socialists fight for national or anti-colonial liberation. Then, at some later date, they start the struggle for socialism. This mechanistic model relegates the project of fighting for socialism to something that will take place at a future, often undefined, point in time. Following this stagism has taken a particular toll on the socialist and communist parties in the Middle East, as they have squandered attempts to build a socialist alternative. For example, Khalid Baktash, the dean of Arab communism and past leader of the Syrian Communist Party, boasted in 1944 about his party's charter being completely devoid of any mention of socialism. The charter contains, he continued, not a single demand or expression tinged with socialism. It is nothing more and nothing less than a democratic national pact. The revolution that our country must undergo is not a socialist revolution, but a national democratic revolution. This approach allied many of the communist parties in the region on the side of national unity, instead of emphasizing the importance of internal conflicts between classes and seeing struggle from below of the workers and the oppressed as the answer. Today, holdovers from Stalinist ways of thinking can be seen in those on the left who express support for counter-revolutionary dictators like Bashar al-Assad, grotesquely defending his butchering of the popular struggle of Syrian people against his regime, rather than taking a simple position both against U.S. imperialism and against Assad. The socialism we mean stresses the need for struggle from below and that of self-emancipation. Similarly, this struggle must be an explicitly international one in its outlook, its actors, and its goal of global destruction of the regime of capital. Some in this book describe this approach as internationalist. This vision of socialism has been succinctly described by American socialist Hal Draper as socialism from below. The heart of socialism from below is its view that socialism can be realized only through the self-emancipation of activated masses in motion, reaching out for freedom with their own hands, mobilized from below in a struggle to take charge of their own destiny, as actors, not merely subjects, on the stage of history. Imperialism. The word imperialism is commonly used as a synonym for a foreign policy of military might, war, and domination. Our definition is slightly different. We view imperialism as the unrelenting process of competition and conflict between the world's capitalist classes of different states, who are vying for domination and exploitation of the globe's people, wealth, and resources. We see the major capitalist states as competing with each other and subjugating less powerful states and peoples to their rule. Our understanding of imperialism is rooted in the theories originally formulated by Marx, Lenin, and Bukharin, which see imperialism not as a policy chosen by states, but as a system rooted in economics that dictates the policy of states. As Bukharin writes, as war is nothing but the continuation of politics by other means, so is politics nothing but the method of the reproduction of certain conditions of production. While military might and conquest are the sharpest edge and most visible expression of this competition and subjugation, imperialism is not only carried out through the barrel of a gun. Economic tools are in some ways the preferred, less messy method implemented by institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and the policies of trade deals, zones, tariffs, and the like are also weapons the ruling classes use for domination. The ruling classes pursue this economic and military violence, to quote Lenin, not out of particular malice, but because the drive for expansion occurs in a world already divided up by capitalism and colonialism, one that makes it imperative that they adopt this method in order to get profits. We do not understand imperialism, as some do, as a trait of only some camps of capitalist states and not other camps. If you have a ruling class integrated into the world economy, then that ruling class must compete, and it is driven into the structure of imperialism. Obviously, there is a hierarchy of the world's states as they jockey for position, and states like the U.S., because of its economic and military power, are far more dominant than others. Understanding how imperialism and capitalism work together is key to not allying with despots and remaining on the side of the people who face the war and devastation created by the system. Put simply, imperialism breeds war and devastates the working class and the oppressed all over the world. As long as capitalism exists, so will imperialism. We only need to look at what's happening in Yemen or Iraq to see proof of this. As we are living in the strongest imperialist country in the world, it's vitally important for us to strengthen and refine our anti-imperialist politics and inject them into all of our struggles, from women's liberation to immigrant rights, and make it clear that our struggles here in the U.S. are intimately tied to the struggles of workers all over the world, including those of workers in countries that are being ruthlessly bombed or starved by the United States. A clear understanding of U.S. imperialism and its aims is the only foundation for consistent opposition to U.S. militarism, domestic and abroad. This means doing away with all the false rhetoric about fighting terrorism, defeating dictators, or defending democracy. And importantly, this means fighting against Islamophobia and right-wing attacks on immigrants and refugees. Anti-imperialism is the cornerstone that upholds the principle of internationalism. This means gaining a deep-rooted understanding of the fact that our bonds with others are not based on borders or nationalities, but on the shared interest of workers and oppressed peoples in resisting oppression and exploitation by ruling classes worldwide. After all, our governments have taught us that they care more about profit than they do people. Foundation to framing. With this as foundation, we turn back to Palestine and the cause of liberation. In this book, we aim to convince you that an international socialist movement, from the bottom up, rooted in the workers and oppressed of this world, is the only path toward liberation for Palestine. Indeed, to be a socialist, you must be a principled champion for Palestine. Part 1 begins by laying out the roots of the struggle today, illuminating the Nakba and the political ideology at the root of Israel's settler colonial project, Zionism. Next, we move to explain how the interests of the U.S. ruling class are deeply invested in alignment and support for Israel as a core plank in the U.S. imperial project. Part 1 ends by offering historical context for the Palestinian liberation movement, spanning from the Nakba to the Second Intifada. Understanding this history is key to drawing lessons from the past and charting a course of struggle today. Part 2 focuses more on the current contours of the struggle for Palestinian liberation, taking into account the various players today, starting with the history of the so-called peace process as an extension of the tentacles of neoliberalism. In this section, we will explain why, despite our insistence on global working-class solidarity as the only vehicle for freedom, The Israeli working class, with its fundamental ties to Israel's settler colonial project, is not an ally of liberation. Last, we consider how the continuously winding revolutionary path of the Arab Spring has shaped this current moment of struggle. In the third section, we highlight the important dynamic of global solidarity. First, the BDS movement and its relation to shifting tides in the struggle. Second, the historical connection between the struggle for Palestine and the Black liberation struggle in the United States. Third, the overlapping dynamic of gender and conceptions of feminism within and beyond Palestine. This is by no means an exhaustive list of the many intersections of Palestine with other struggles against oppression, from Kashmir to Standing Rock. In our conclusion, we attempt to draw these strands together. To make the case for the need to connect the liberation of Palestine with a struggle against imperialism and global capitalism, both in a diagnosis of the situation and in a prescription for freedom. The tremendous force that will be needed to win that goal must not be constrained by the narrow confines of the bourgeois state under the capitalist order. In this, we look toward regional uprisings and global movements as the hope for the international working class to win freedom for Palestine, and indeed freedom for us all, from the river to the sea and across the entire world. Spring 2020. Part 1. Circumstances given and transmitted from the past. 1. Roots of the Nakba. Zionist settler colonialism. Sumaya Awad and Annie Levin. Palestine, before 1948. Olive groves stretching across rolling hills, dotting the land between mountains and the Mediterranean Sea. Orange groves, too, sprinkled by the hundreds around Jerusalem and Jaffa, weaving through smaller villages and towns, where agriculture kept entire Palestinian communities economically self-sufficient. Cinemas and theaters featuring new entertainment that rocked the world at the time. Cafes and bakeries, where Palestinians and people in transit from across the region filtered through on a daily basis on their way to school, a meeting, or a doctor's appointment, with some of the finest physicians in the region. Each Palestinian city and town had an identity, a rich history and tradition, perhaps best reflected in unique tatriz patterns or embroidery stitches attributed to different regions. Traditions of 3 different faiths existed side by side. A railway system connected Jerusalem to Damascus and Haifa to smaller towns and villages on the Palestinian coast, where workers traveled in droves to fill factories at the turn of the 20th century. A vibrant trade port in Haifa welcomed ships crossing the Mediterranean with supplies and sent them off laden with produce and other goods. To the south, Palestine served as a direct route to North Africa, where, in the decades to come, revolutionaries would begin their struggle for independence from British, French, Spanish, and Italian colonizers. It's easy to romanticize what existed before Israel was established and before systematic ethnic cleansing campaigns were organized to erase any semblance of Palestinian history, culture, and identity. What is today the Levant was not yet spliced into separate countries with outlined borders. That would come later, with pacts made with European imperialists staking their claims on the Middle East, mainly through the Balfour Declaration and Sykes-Picot Agreement. Prior to these, borders differentiating Syria from Lebanon and the east and west banks of the Jordan River were porous, though not entirely ineffectual. Still, one thing is abundantly clear from historical accounts of Palestine before 1948. Palestinians existed. They thrived politically, culturally, and socially, and, like others across the global South, they were immersed in a sustained struggle for independence. What is the Nakba, and how must we talk about it? The Nakba refers to the ethnic cleansing of Palestine in 1948, when, over a period of several months, Jewish militia groups known as the Irgun and Haganah conducted raids, massacres, and depopulation campaigns across Palestine, all under orders from Zionist leadership, which aimed to drive Palestinians out en masse. The Irgun and Haganah would later form the basis for Israel's military, the Israel Defense Forces. Through the Nakba, Israel established itself as a sovereign state on Palestinian land, and the world's largest refugee population to date was born. In a period characterized by independence and decolonization across the global South, Israel was founded as a settler colonial state on occupied land. In 1947 to 48, 400 Palestinian villages were completely destroyed, replaced in many cases by illegal settlements, resorts, and parks, all of which Palestinians are barred from entering. The term catastrophe, the literal translation of the word Nakba, cannot do justice to the aftermath of ethnic cleansing. When remembering the Nakba became a punishable crime, Palestinian became synonymous with terrorist, and history was written to erase not just the identity of Palestinians, but their humanity as well. Crucial to the understanding of these events are the 3 decades of colonial expansion in Palestine and the broader Middle East following the First World War. In the early 20th century, as the Yishuv began to grow and the Balfour Declaration of 1917 was signed, legitimizing the Zionist project and its claim to Palestinian land, tensions began to fester. The following years saw the Zionist seizure of indigenous land, and the struggle for Palestine began. The British, after giving Zionist leaders approval and supporting the building of an exclusionary Jewish state, could not mediate a constructive plan or gain the trust of the Palestinians or the Arabs at large, whose lands had been carved up by Britain and other European colonial powers after the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire. In the late 1940s, the United Nations intervened with the 1947 Partition Plan, which divided Palestinian land into areas designated for Jewish settlement and areas for Palestinians, legitimizing the Zionist claim to control over the land. Plan Dalet, commonly referred to as Plan D, was the Haganah's initiative to forcibly take over not only all areas allocated to the Jewish community by the United Nations Resolution of 1947, but also any areas the Yishuv deemed critical to ensure the further expansion of the Jewish state on Palestinian land. The Haganah was divided into brigades, each with the responsibility of occupying a list of villages. Occupation most often entailed complete destruction. Few villages were left intact after Plan D had run its course. This was a deliberate campaign to raze all Palestinian homes, schools, and hospitals to the ground, so there would be nothing left for Palestinians to return to. One of the most notorious of the Haganah militias was the Alexandroni Brigade. The brigade was given a list of 64 villages sprinkled between Upper Haifa down to modern-day Tel Aviv. On this list was the village of Tantura. In the 1940s, the village of Tantura was a Palestinian coastal community on the shores of the Mediterranean. Its proximity to the sea tied...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?